Today we're going to pick up with physiology. We left off last time and talked a little bit about physiology, about the different ways that hormones could be released as far as humoral, hormonal, or neural stimuli. Today we're going to talk about the different ways that we can alter target cell response, how different hormones can act together on different target cells, and then we'll go through each one of the pathways individually. We probably won't get through them all today, but we'll get started. So the first thing to be aware of is that hormones can alter, or based on the hormone level, a target cell can alter its responsiveness to a hormone. So we've got two situations where a cell can what's called upregulate its receptors, or cells can downregulate their receptors. And actually, we have very low levels of a hormone, then target cells can upregulate their receptors, meaning that they can make more and stick them up in the plasma membrane. So upregulation is what would happen in response to very low levels of hormones. So target cells will upregulate their receptors, which will make them more sensitive to the circulating levels of whatever hormone it is. So if it's just, we've got just a couple hormones, molecules floating about in the system, then the target cells can upregulate their receptors so that they're more sensitive. Downregulation is what happens in the other case. So if we have just a ton of hormone present, let's say you're chronically stressed, and you've got a whole bunch of cortisol out in the system, then the cell can actually pull its receptors in by receptor-mediated endocytosis, and we would bring them in then and pull them out of the plasma membrane, and that way the cell will stop being responsive to those hormones. So downregulation is going to decrease the sensitivity to a hormone. So this would be in response to very high levels. And this would be to decrease the sensitivity. And we would upregulate to increase our sensitivity. Good on this? Now what happens when we have target cells that are targets for more than one receptor? We have to think about the ways that hormones interact. And they can interact one of three ways. Hormones can either be what are called synergists. And a synergist, what will happen is when you've got both hormones bound, you get an amplified response that's more than just additive. So we would say that response with synergistic hormones increased relative to either hormone alone. I'm just going to throw out arbitrary numbers as an example, but growth hormone and thyroid hormone are synergistic hormones. So let's say you've got a cell that's a target for growth hormone, and when growth hormone's bound, it experiences 1 unit growth. Or when thyroid hormone is bound, it experiences 1 unit of growth. When both thyroid hormone and growth hormone are bound, then that cell would experience 3 units of growth. So you get more of an effect when our synergistic hormones are working together. So that's the first way hormones can interact at target cells. The next way is what's called permissive. And when you've got hormones that are permissive for each other, one hormone is going to amplify the response of the next. So a great example of this is estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is permissive for progesterone. So all throughout the first half of the ovarian cycle, estrogen is being released in high levels and it's increasing progesterone receptor production. So that after ovulation, the uterus has a lot more progesterone receptors. So estrogen's actions are permitting progesterone's actions later by increasing the amount of progesterone receptors we have. The last way that hormones can interact is antagonistically, and this is when they would have the opposite effect at target tissues. So a good example of antagonists are insulin and glucagon. Insulin is released when blood glucose levels are high and stimulates cells to uptake glucose and stimulates storage. Glucagon is released when blood glucose levels are low, and it helps to release glucose stores. So they're antagonists. They have opposite effects at our target tissues. Any questions on that so far? All right then, let's get into the nitty-gritty of our physiology. So, how are all of our different hormone pathways regulated? So, we talked about these last time. We said they could be regulated humerally, which is something in the blood, like a drop in blood calcium would stimulate parathyroid hormone release. Hormonally, where they are directly stimulated, one hormone release is directly stimulated by another hormone. Or neurally, where we have some type of nervous stimulation is going to stimulate hormone release. All right, so we talked about the anatomy of the hypothalamus last week. As far as the physiology goes, let's talk about that. So, if we look at our hypothalamus, it sits up here above the pituitary. And it has a bunch of nuclei, which are clusters of the cell bodies of the neurons that are going to be releasing and releasing inhibiting hormones, as well as our posterior pituitary hormones. So, as far as the anatomy of our hypothalamus goes, we can say for the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus is going to go releasing and release inhibiting hormones. Those are going to be dumped into the primary plexus of the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. They travel through the portal veins, and they pool around cells in the anterior pituitary. So we're going to go through each one of those pathways individually, but for now, let's talk about these posterior pituitary hormones. So we've got neurons that produce oxytocin and another hormone called antidiuretic hormone, and they're produced in the somas, they're stored in little synaptic vesicles, and are released when needed. So these are our posterior pituitary hormones. They're also called nonapeptides, and that's because they have 9 amino acids. Okay, I'm going to rewrite that. Nonapeptides. And they are released in response to a couple different things. Oxytocin the stimulus for release is going to be neural. So there's going to be some kind of nervous stimulation that's going to stimulate oxytocin to be released. And oxytocin targets reproductive smooth muscle. So oxytocin is released at orgasm. It's also released during labor. So when a woman is in her 9th month gestation, she's big and ripe and ready to deliver, she's got a baby that should hopefully turn upside down and be pushing down on her cervix. So when that baby drops and really starts pushing down on her cervix, that's going to be the neural stimulation that starts oxytocin going. So this we could say is the cervix. And what happens then is this nervous stimulation will stimulate oxytocin release. And oxytocin targets reproductive smooth muscle. So it targets the smooth muscle in the uterus, and the uterus contracts. So it's a potent stimulator of uterine contraction. So when the uterus contracts, the baby's head pushes down on the cervix more. So you get more neural stimulation to release more oxytocin. More oxytocin is released, it stimulates the contraction of the uterus more, the baby pushes down on the cervix more, and you start a positive feedback loop. This is one of the only positive feedback loops in the body, but you start a positive feedback loop where increasing levels of oxytocin result in increasing uterine contraction, result in increasing levels of oxytocin. And this will continue until the baby's born. And the other thing that this oxytocin is doing, it's kind of neat, is it's when this huge surge in oxytocin is going to come over here and it's going to inhibit dopamine release. If you remember, dopamine is the prolactin inhibiting hormone. So when you have high levels of oxytocin present in the system, now they will inhibit dopamine release, and you can, by inhibiting the inhibitor, you can start prolactin production. So that's just something to be aware of. We'll look at that again when we look at prolactin. But that's what's going on in the system as far as oxytocin goes. And then as long as the woman is breastfeeding, that's another positive feedback loop. There will be nervous stimulation from the nipples that cause oxytocin release. Oxytocin stimulates milk letdown. Milk lets down, it ejects into the baby's mouth, it suckles more, you get more nervous stimulation and more oxytocin release. So it's another positive feedback loop that happens during lactation, and as long as the woman is nursing, she will inhibit those dopaminergic neurons that are inhibiting our prolactin release from the anterior pituitary. So prolactin will be able to be released and stimulate milk protein production, and oxytocin will be released when the baby nurses to stimulate milk letdown. Okay? Any questions on oxytocin? All right, antidiuretic hormone is our next posterior pituitary hormone, and it is the antidiuretic hormone. So diuresis is peeing. Dia means through, and uresis is the urinary system. So antidiuretic hormone is anti-peeing. And so what it does is it's released in response to a couple things. It can be released in response to dehydration. So the stimulus for antidiuretic hormone release could be dehydration. This part of the board really is not great. Another thing that can stimulate its release is a drop in blood pressure. So if we've got a drop in blood pressure, we need to raise our blood volume, and we can do that by uptaking water. So antidiuretic hormone is released, and its target is the kidneys. And at the kidneys, it's going to stimulate the production of these things called aquaporins. We'll talk more about this when we get to the urinary system. And aquaporins are just like they sound. They allow aqua, or water, to pour in. And so we'll pull water out of the fluid that was becoming urine. So antidiuretic hormone stimulates aquaporin production. And what we can say about aquaporins is that they're water channels that are going to allow water to be pulled out of the urine. So it'll allow water to be pulled out of the urine and put into the blood. Any questions on the posterior pituitary or its relationship to the hypothalamus, anything like that? So what you should have noticed in your slides when you were looking at the anterior versus posterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary is very cellular, it's glandular, it's got a ton of cells in it. The posterior pituitary is not really that cellular. There's a lot more open space, and the little nuclei that you see are the nuclei of glial cells. Because these are neurons running down here. Their somas are up in those hypothalamic nuclei. So all the little purple spots you saw in the posterior pituitary are glial cells. All right, now let's look at the anterior pituitary. We can't leave the hypothalamus out because it's regulating our anterior pituitary. So I think I'll draw our general picture up here, and then I'll go through each pathway on the boards. So for our anterior pituitary, this is going to be that part that is responsive to these hormones that are coming through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal-portal system. So all of our releasing and release-inhibiting hormones. And we can look at these one at a time. So if we look at our, here, I'll do it over here. Our growth hormone pathway, the cells in the anterior pituitary that are secreting growth hormone are our somatotropes. And these are the only cells that are under dual regulation by an inhibiting hormone and a release-inhibiting hormone. So a releasing hormone and a release-inhibiting hormone, my apologies. So if we look at what's coming out of the hypothalamus and affecting these cells, we've got growth hormone, releasing hormone, or growth hormone, release-inhibiting hormone, which is this chemical called somatostatin. So both of those will affect our somatotropes. And during the day, growth hormone, release-inhibiting hormone is in higher levels, and it's winning out. So that mostly throughout the day, you've got pretty low levels of growth hormone. At night, our pineal gland, kind of put this just off over to the side, our pineal gland is releasing melatonin. Melatonin inhibits growth hormone, release-inhibiting hormone. So by inhibiting the inhibitor, you stop the inhibition on the somatotropes, and growth hormone releasing hormone can stimulate growth hormone release. This is why sometimes it seems like kids grow 2 inches overnight. They're doing most of their growth at night. So our somatotropes have both growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone release inhibiting hormone receptors. If both are bound, the inhibiting hormone wins and you don't release growth hormone. But like I said, at night when we are inhibiting it, we'll have growth hormone release. It can bind its receptor, we'll release growth hormone. And growth hormone is going to target, during childhood, almost every cell in the body. So what are the effects of growth hormone? Well, it helps with growing. So we could say for growth hormone, targets all over the body. And what's it going to do? It'll stimulate protein production. Stimulates anabolism of all sorts. So anabolism is building up of things. So growth hormone is really helping things to grow. After childhood, the main target for growth hormone is the liver. So at the liver, what it does, growth hormone binds cells in the liver, hepatocytes, and they will release a hormone called insulin-like growth factor, or IGFs. So these are insulin-like growth factors. And our IGFs, during childhood and during adulthood, stimulate cartilage growth. This is why noses and ears never stop growing. Old men in particular seem to have very big noses and ears, and it's because they're always producing low levels of growth hormone and always producing insulin-like growth factors.